The smell of antiseptic clings to everything in this place. My clothes, my hair, the spaces between my fingers where hope used to live. I'm Dr. Clara Bennett, and I've been running on empty for longer than I care to admit. 3 months since the divorce papers were signed. 6 months since I lost the baby. A year since I stopped believing that healing others could somehow heal the hollow places inside myself. The small-town clinic where I work feels like a holding pattern now. We see the casualties of economic collapse. Pets surrendered because their families can't afford food, strays multiplying in abandoned neighborhoods, animals bearing the silent weight of human desperation. I go through the motions because that's what remains when everything else falls away. My hands still know their work, even when my heart has forgotten why it matters. I need to tell you something before this story goes any deeper. Can you leave a comment telling me where you're watching from? Your country? Your city? Sometimes when I'm working late and the clinic feels like the loneliest place on earth, I wonder if there are others out there who understand what it means to keep going when you've forgotten what you're going toward. The dog came in 15 minutes before closing on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday. Gray, humid, thick with the weight of things left unsaid. A teenage boy named Jake had found him near the abandoned train yard, sitting perfectly still in front of the rusted gates like a sentinel awaiting orders. Jake said the dog had been there for hours, maybe days, unmoving despite the occasional freight train that still rumbled through. He just, "Let me pick him up," Jake explained, his voice uncertain. Didn't struggle or nothing, like he was waiting for someone to find him. The dog was medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, with shaggy fur the color of winter wheat and pale amber eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. No collar, no identification, no signs of recent care. But what struck me most was the absence of scent. Every animal carries something: earth, oil, fear, the particular musk of their own body. This one smelled of nothing, not even himself. My assistant Mara helped me get him onto the examination table. He didn't resist, didn't show any of the typical signs of stress or confusion that we see in strays. His compliance was too complete, too controlled. It reminded me of military dogs I'd worked with years ago, animals trained to suppress their natural responses for a higher purpose. "What do you think his story is?" Mara asked, making notes on his intake form. I ran my hands along his body, checking for injuries, signs of abuse, anything that might explain his unusual demeanor. His temperature was low, 94 degrees, but he showed no signs of hypothermia. His heartbeat was steady but oddly rhythmic, like a metronome keeping time to music only he could hear. When I lifted his lips to examine his teeth, I felt the first real resistance. It wasn't fear. It was alertness. The kind of tension that comes from training, from purpose, from knowing that certain boundaries cannot be crossed without consequence. "Let's just have a look," I murmured, more to myself than to him. The room had grown cold, though neither of us had adjusted the thermostat. I gently pried his mouth open. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Pink gums, healthy teeth, a tongue that was perhaps slightly paler than expected. But as I angled the examination light for a better view, something caught my attention. There, embedded in the soft tissue at the roof of his mouth, was what looked like a thin, translucent membrane. It wasn't metallic like a microchip, but organic, almost like a second layer of skin that had grown over something beneath. The membrane was patterned with delicate lines that formed shapes I couldn't immediately identify. Geometric, but flowing. Purposeful, but beautiful. When I touched it gently with a probe, the dog didn't flinch, but the pattern seemed to shimmer for just a moment, like oil on water catching light. The entire room fell silent. Not just quiet. Silent. The fluorescent lights stopped their usual humming. The air conditioning paused mid-cycle. Even the other animals in the back kennels, who had been making the typical sounds of a busy clinic, went completely still. It was as if everything living had suddenly held its breath. Mara tried to take a photograph for the medical record, but her camera malfunctioned. The image came out as a blur of static and distorted pixels. We tried again with my phone. Same result. Whatever was in this dog's mouth didn't want to be documented. But why did the room feel like it was waiting for something? Over the next 2 hours, we ran every test available in our small clinic. The results were inconsistent. His internal anatomy showed subtle variations from normal canine structure, organs that appeared shifted slightly, as if arranged to accommodate something additional. Blood samples coagulated within seconds of being drawn, making standard testing impossible. And beneath the skin on his neck, something pulsed with its own rhythm, distinct from his heartbeat. That evening, I made the decision to keep him overnight for observation. I named him Echo, though I couldn't say why the name felt so immediately right. As closing time approached and Mara headed home to her family, I found myself reluctant to leave. Something about Echo's presence was both comforting and unsettling, like sitting next to a fire that might warm you or consume you depending on forces beyond your control. I sat with him in the dim back office, fluorescent lights flickering as if uncertain whether to stay on. Echo regarded me with those amber eyes, unblinking, patient. In the growing darkness, I found myself speaking aloud, something I rarely did anymore. "Who are you?" I whispered. For just a moment, I could have sworn he understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. The real question I was asking wasn't about his identity, but about purpose, about whether anything that appeared in our lives came by accident, or if some arrivals were orchestrated by forces we couldn't see. The next morning brought the visitor I should have expected, but somehow didn't. He appeared at the clinic's front door just as I was unlocking it, a man in his 50s wearing a long black coat despite the unseasonable warmth. He didn't look like law enforcement or animal control, but there was an authority in his bearing that made my chest tighten with instinctive wariness. "Dr. Bennett?" His voice was even, professionally neutral. "I'm here regarding an animal that may have been brought to your clinic recently." He didn't introduce himself or show identification, didn't explain how he knew my name or why he was there. Instead, he asked if I'd received any unusual animals in the last 48 hours. The way he phrased it, not lost animals or strays, but unusual animals, made every instinct scream warnings I couldn't quite articulate. I lied without hesitation. "Nothing out of the ordinary." "Why?" He handed me a business card that contained no phone number, no address, no company name, just a symbol, 3 interlocking rings rendered in dark ink, and beneath it, a single word: retrieval. "If you do encounter anything unexpected," he said, "please call the number on the back." But when I flipped the card over, it was blank. And if stories like this move your heart the way they move mine, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. Because what I discovered about Echo would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between species, between the natural and the impossible. That night, I discovered that our security cameras had malfunctioned. All footage from the previous 48 hours was corrupted beyond recovery. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, too thorough to be accidental. Someone wanted Echo's arrival to remain undocumented, and they had the resources to make it happen. I made the decision to take Echo home with me. My house had been too quiet since the divorce, too empty since the miscarriage. David had moved out 3 months ago, taking not just his belongings, but somehow the very possibility of sound. I'd grown accustomed to eating dinner in silence, to falling asleep to the hum of appliances rather than conversation. Echo's presence filled the space differently than another person might have. Not with noise, but with the sense that someone was listening. I began talking to him during those long evening hours. Not the way you might speak to a pet, with commands or baby talk, but the way you confide in someone who has earned your trust through their willingness to simply be present. I told him about the baby we'd lost at 12 weeks, how the silence after that loss had been so complete it seemed to hollow out my chest. About how David's attempt at comfort had felt like being patted by someone wearing gloves. Technically correct, but emotionally distant. Echo would sit nearby during these conversations, close enough that I could feel his warmth but never actually touching. His attention was complete, unwavering, as if my words carried weight that deserved careful consideration. It was the first time in months that speaking my pain aloud felt like healing rather than bleeding. Then I began noticing his responses to specific words. When I mentioned feeling lost, his ears would perk up with recognition. When I spoke about the baby, about the future we'd planned that would never exist, he would tilt his head in a way that seemed less like confusion and more like comprehension. And when I finally said the word that had been lodging in my throat for months, empty, Echo stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness as if searching for something. One evening, about 2 weeks after bringing him home, exhaustion and grief finally overwhelmed my careful composure. I found myself sobbing into my hands, the kind of raw, ugly crying that comes when you finally stop trying to hold yourself together. Through my tears, I felt Echo approach and gently place his paw on my knee. The warmth that radiated from that simple contact was unlike anything I'd experienced. Not just physical heat, but something deeper, a recognition, an acknowledgement that my grief was real and witnessed and worthy of tenderness. For the first time since losing the baby, I felt like my pain had been truly seen, but it was his response to language that convinced me Echo was something beyond ordinary. He began reacting to words I'd never taught him, concepts that seemed to resonate through his entire body. When I said home, he would look toward the door with what I could only describe as longing. Truth made him go completely still, as if the word itself required reverence. And gone, that word caused him to emit a soft whine that sounded almost like mourning. But it was what happened when I asked, "Why me?" that changed everything. Echo opened his mouth and released a single sound. Not a bark or whine or any vocalization I'd heard from an animal before. It was a note, pure, harmonic, resonating with something that felt older than sound itself. The windows in my living room vibrated gently. The water in my coffee cup rippled in concentric circles. If you're feeling this moment the way I did when it happened, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Because what I discovered next would convince me that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be experienced. 2 weeks later, I decided I needed to understand what was embedded in Echo's mouth. I couldn't continue providing proper veterinary care without knowing what I was dealing with, and my conscience wouldn't let me ignore a potential health issue, no matter how unusual its presentation. I prepared the clinic's surgery suite with the same care I'd use for any procedure: sterile instruments, monitoring equipment, everything needed for a safe extraction. Echo seemed to understand what was happening. He walked onto the examination table without encouragement and lay down as if consenting to whatever needed to be done. I'd prepared sedation, but Echo's calm suggested it might not be necessary. His amber eyes watched my preparations with interest rather than fear, as if he'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. "Okay, boy," I whispered, positioning the surgical light. "Let's see what you're hiding." I opened his mouth slowly, my hands steadier than they'd been in months. The membrane was exactly as I remembered: translucent, patterned, beautiful in its strangeness. As I reached for the surgical forceps, preparing to take a small sample for analysis, something extraordinary happened. The membrane began to glow, not bright, but unmistakable. A soft blue radiance that pulsed in rhythm with Echo's heartbeat. The pattern of lines seemed to flow like liquid, rearranging themselves into new configurations even as I watched. Mara, who was assisting, gasped audibly. The surgical instruments on the tray began to vibrate, creating a soft, harmonic hum. Then, every piece of electronic equipment in the room shut down simultaneously. The surgical lights went dark. The monitoring equipment fell silent. Even the digital clock on the wall stopped, its display going completely blank. We were left in the dim light filtering through the windows, the only sound our own breathing and the continued humming from the metal instruments. When I looked back into Echo's mouth 30 seconds later, the membrane was gone. In its place, etched into the soft tissue at the roof of his mouth, were symbols. Not random markings, but deliberate, precise engravings that seemed to have been carved with impossible delicacy. The symbols were familiar in a way that made my heart race, though I couldn't immediately place why. It wasn't until I returned home that evening that the recognition hit me like a physical blow. In my bedroom dresser, wrapped in tissue paper and hidden beneath old photographs, was a silver pendant that had belonged to my sister Rachel. She'd been wearing it the day she disappeared during a camping trip in 1997, when she was 16 and I was 12. The pendant was the only trace of her ever found, discovered 3 months later by hikers nearly 50 miles from where she'd vanished. I retrieved the pendant with trembling hands and compared it to the photographs I'd taken of Echo's mouth. The symbols were identical. Every curve, every angle, every detail matched perfectly. Rachel had been gone for 26 years. The case was never solved. Our parents spent their remaining years searching for answers that never came, and I'd grown up in the shadow of that unresolved loss. The pendant was all we had left of her, a mystery we'd never understood, a connection to a sister who'd simply walked into the woods one morning and never walked back out. But now those same symbols were literally part of Echo, embedded in his flesh like a message I was finally ready to receive. I don't know what Echo truly is. I don't think knowledge like that comes through explanation or analysis. What I know is that he was sent, not from a laboratory or government facility, but from somewhere that heard my grief and responded with exactly what I needed. Not answers, but companionship. Not solutions, but presence. Since that day, Echo has led me to others like him. 3 more dogs, each found in impossible circumstances, each carrying their own silent purpose. They don't bark or play or behave like ordinary animals. They find graves that have been forgotten, sleep beside the broken until healing begins, appear in the lives of people who have stopped believing they deserve comfort. I've started dreaming again, not the nightmares that plagued me after the miscarriage, but visions of a voice that speaks words I feel rather than hear. You were chosen because you still believe in silence, because you understand that some truths can only be whispered. The work continues. Echo and I travel now, following instincts I can't explain to places where we're needed. The clinic has become a way station for animals that exist between categories, creatures that challenge our understanding of what's possible while offering exactly what's necessary. But I know this isn't over. Sometimes, when Echo stares at the door long past midnight, his body tense with attention I can't share. I feel them watching. The people who came looking for him haven't forgotten. The forces that sent him haven't finished their work. And somewhere, in the space between what we know and what we hope, my sister's voice echoes through symbols carved in impossible places, reminding me that love doesn't end with disappearance. It just learns to speak in languages we're still learning to hear. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched something in you, please subscribe and let me know in the comments. Your presence here means more than you know, because sometimes the greatest healing comes from knowing we're not alone in our questions, even when the answers remain beautifully, mysteriously out of reach.